When a survivor of narcissistic abuse begins to heal, there is always a strange moment, a moment so quiet you almost don't notice it, yet powerful enough to fracture the narcissist's sense of certainty. It is not your anger, it is not the pain you once tried to explain with thousands of words, it is not the desperation you used to keep the relationship alive. It is the moment you withdraw your emotional energy and stand in a calmness they cannot read, cannot predict, and cannot control. In that silent shift, you activate something they themselves don't understand. The shadow they have spent their entire life running from. Jung says the shadow contains everything the ego refuses to face. Hidden, denied, and feared parts of the unconscious. And when you stop giving them reactions, when your heart no longer trembles in their chaos, you become the mirror that reflects that shadow back to them. Not through words, not through judgment, but through the only force they cannot combat, your neutrality. This is the shadow trigger, the activation that makes their inflated ego slip out of place, causes the cracks to appear, and forces them to utter an apology they themselves don't understand. They don't apologize because they understand your pain. They apologize because for the first time they feel the world they built slipping out of their control. A world in which you always reacted, always explained, always softened. When you stop doing all of that, the psychological structure they depend on begins to shake. And in that trembling, the shadow emerges. This is why a narcissist apologizes without knowing why, not out of empathy, but out of fear. Fear of losing access, losing influence, and losing the supply that once made them feel invincible. Today, we are going to unlock this mechanism, not to bring them back, not to make them better, but to show you the deep power that rises when you stop being the ground they walk on and begin to reclaim the sovereignty of your own soul. In Jungian psychology, every human carries two parts: the conscious self we choose to show the world, and the shadow self where we hide what we refuse to acknowledge. For the narcissist, the gap between these two parts is so vast that they live split in half. On the outside, confident, intelligent, charming, and powerful. On the inside, a panicked child, terrified of abandonment, terrified of being seen, terrified of being exposed as not enough. They never touch that shadow, because even a single crack would cause the entire ego structure they built to collapse. And this is precisely why the shadow trigger has the power to make them apologize without knowing why. When you still react, still explain, still try, still hurt, your emotions reinforce their ego's belief, I still have power. But the moment you step out of that game, when you become calm, when you no longer react according to the old pattern, when you no longer play the role they are used to controlling, their entire mask begins to fracture. What scares them is not your silence, it is the shift inside your unconscious. They realize the emotional energy that once fed them no longer flows toward them. The mirror that once reflected their idealized image is now empty. In that instant, they no longer see the perfect version of themselves they clung to. What they see is their own shadow, fear of abandonment, emptiness, meaninglessness, and helplessness. The same wounds they buried since childhood. And it is this confrontation with their shadow, not your pain, that forces them to react. This mechanism operates in their unconscious. They feel loss of power, instability, fear, but they have no language for it. Their ego doesn't understand what's happening, but the shadow does. The shadow senses that the supply source is leaving the system, and to keep the system alive, it forces them into a behavior that looks like an apology. It is a survival reflex, not empathy. It is like their psyche throwing a rope to pull you back, even though they don't understand why their hand is doing it. They are not aware that your calmness is what triggers their most primitive fear. This is why their apologies often feel strange, vague, half-hearted, emotionally empty, yet appearing exactly at the moment you finally stand up for yourself. For them, an apology is not an admission of wrongdoing. It is a desperate attempt to patch a collapsing inner world. Once you understand this mechanism, you see that real power doesn't lie in confrontation or proving who is right. It lies in calmness, in reclaiming your energy, and in no longer being fuel for their shadow. For the narcissist, your emotions are not just emotions. They are fuel that sustains their sense of identity and power. Every time you defend yourself, explain, argue, or show pain, you unconsciously affirm that they still matter in your inner world. That is why no argument, no matter how intense, destabilizes them. It actually strengthens them. They feel in control as long as you are reacting. But emotional withdrawal is entirely different. When you stop reacting, stop explaining, stop showing them your pain, you dismantle the psychological foundation they use to define themselves. To them, your withdrawal is a silent emptiness, not the silent treatment, but a silence that no longer belongs to them. They do not know how to face this kind of disappearance. It creates an unconscious void that confuses and unsettles them in ways they cannot express. Jung describes this as the moment the ego is forced to confront the reality it always feared. The reality that its power is not absolute and it is not the center of the universe. When you withdraw, you stop being the emotional object they rely on to feel real. This causes them to lose their internal sense of orientation, like someone suddenly noticing their shadow has disappeared. And in this disorientation, the shadow rises. It stirs the fear of abandonment, the fear of insignificance, the fear of being invisible, wounds the narcissist has spent a lifetime covering with admiration and control. Your emotional withdrawal strikes directly at this primordial fracture. That is why it has more impact than any scream, accusation, or argument. Your calmness gives them no battleground to win, no chance to play victim, no leverage to manipulate. Withdrawal becomes an energetic hole they cannot fill, and when they cannot fill it, they begin to panic. Psychology calls this a supply disruption. Jung calls it the cracking of the persona. This crack leads them to two unconscious reactions: rage to pull you back, or an apology to put out the fire. An apology driven by fear, not understanding. No unspoken understanding. Their apology is an attempt to restore the pattern that no longer works. This is why they apologize only when you no longer expect it, because your calmness is the signal that shakes their ego in silence. Once you understand this, you realize what destroys a narcissist is not your explosive strength, but your quiet strength, the strength you build when you remove yourself from their game. What confuses many people is that they assume when the narcissist apologizes, it's a sign of change, understanding, or genuine remorse. But in the psychological structure of a narcissistic personality, empathy is not the operating system. The operating system is benefit. This is why their apology is never the moral awakening you've been hoping for. It is an unconscious survival reflex generated by the very shadow they've buried. When you withdraw your energy, they don't only lose supply, they lose the escape route out of their own self. A narcissist uses you as a mirror to verify their existence. Without your reaction, their ego falls into a state of disorientation. It's as if they suddenly lose their own reflection and no longer know where they stand. In that moment, the shadow rises and begins steering their responses. The shadow knows that if they let you go, if they allow this distance to grow, their supply will hit bottom, and their already fragile ego will be completely exposed. When faced with that threat, they do not act from awareness, but from instinct. And instinct chooses the quickest route to pull you back: an apology. This is what Jung called a personality's defensive reaction under threat. It bypasses morality, bypasses logic, and moves through their deepest fear. It is the fear of abandonment. They hide behind pride and power. When you pull away, that fear awakens and forces them to behave softer, sweeter, more remorseful, even if in their mind they don't truly understand what they're doing. This is why their apology is hollow, vague, and missing detail. They say, "I'm sorry. I don't want to lose you. I acted badly." But they never mention the specific behaviors that hurt you, simply because they cannot connect those behaviors to your emotions. They can only connect them to the threat they are facing. Their apology is an attempt to pull you back into your old position where you reacted, explained, and got sucked into their storm. Not because they understand, but because they fear losing power. And the most striking part is, even they do not understand why they are doing it. Their ego hates apologizing because it sees apology as surrender, but the shadow pushes them to apologize to preserve supply. This is the inner conflict they are not mature enough to recognize. A narcissist lives in a split between who they believe they are and the part of themselves they refuse to see. When you withdraw, you force these two parts to collide. The apology bursts out like a pulled trigger, not from the heart, but from an internal collapse they are trying to hide. When you understand this, you will no longer be fooled by their apology. You will see it for what it truly is, not an act of love, but a symptom of the fracture in the world they built by controlling you. In the narcissist's psychological architecture, power is not something they possess. It is something they borrow from your reactions. They have no inner stability, so they rely entirely on controlling your emotional state. When you're angry, they feel significant. When you're hurt, they feel impactful. When you explain, they feel pursued. When you try to make them understand, they feel central. This is why every reaction you give reinforces their position in your story. But when you become calm, when you stop explaining, stop reacting, stop participating in their psychological game, you create a power vacuum, a silent space they cannot locate. What terrifies them is not the silence itself, but the fact that you are no longer participating in the psychological structure they built to keep you beneath them. Jung said that when a dependent personality is cut off from its source of nourishment, its unconscious enters a state of freefall. It no longer knows where to lean, where to project, or whether it still has power. For the narcissist, power exists only when they can see their impact on you. When you no longer react, this reflective surface disappears. And when their self-ambiguous no longer being mirrored, their ego begins to fade, like a flame losing oxygen. This moment creates a void they cannot tolerate. Even if they act cold, distant, or aggressive, inside they are panicking because they can no longer predict what you're thinking. You become an autonomous entity, uncontrollable, unreadable, unmanipulable. This is what they hate and fear the most, someone they cannot read. Because when they can't read you, they don't know where they stand. They don't know if you still fear them, still love them, still hurt because of them. And to the narcissistic mind, not knowing is a form of pain. They need your reactions to know their position in your life. Without reaction, they lose position. Losing position means losing supply. Losing supply means losing power. Losing power means losing identity. This is the spiral of internal collapse. Most survivors never see. Outwardly, they may act normal, even arrogant, but inside they are terrified of the signs that you are changing. You speak less, react less, text less, explain less. They begin to feel you stepping out of their energetic field. This is the moment Jung called the moment of psychic destabilization, the point where the ego loses balance and the unconscious takes over. In this state, their unconscious forces them into behaviors their ego dislikes, trying to soothe you, fix things, apologize, not because they regret, but because they are trying to patch the power vacuum your calm has created. They apologize not because they see you, but because they fear losing themselves, because they feel the void growing and they can no longer control the distance. Your calmness is, in essence, a silent declaration that you have detached your soul from their bondage. And nothing activates their shadow more intensely than sensing they are losing what they always assumed belonged to them by default. The apology appears as a last resort to fill this void. It is not an act of maturity, but the desperate reflex of an ego losing its foothold. When you understand this mechanism, you will no longer see their apology as a sign of change. You will see it as a sign of collapse. A narcissist spends their entire life building a persona, a perfect, charming, confident, untouchable mask. But behind that mask lies a vast void of fear, shame, envy, and worthlessness they never dare to look at. Jung calls this the shadow, the deepest buried part of the self, locked away through denial. They don't want to know it. They don't want to see it, and never want it to surface. Yet it is your calmness, your quiet withdrawal without anger, without explanation, that becomes the key that unlocks that unconscious door. When you are calm, they no longer have anywhere to project blame, no longer have your emotions to cling to, no longer have your reactions to define themselves. And in that silence, for the first time in a very long time, they are forced to hear the echo coming from within. That echo carries the truth they always feared. They are not as important as they thought. They do not control you the way they imagined. They are no longer the center of your world. This is the moment the shadow rises, not to heal, but to retaliate against the ego for burying it for so long. The shadow reminds them that all the power they believed they had was only an illusion, sustained by your reactions. When the reactions disappear, the illusion collapses with them. And that is when they fall into cognitive dissonance. The ego says, I am still powerful. The shadow says, no, you have nothing left. This clash creates a state of inner chaos they have no capacity to handle. An emotionally mature person can sit with themselves, reflect, and heal, but a narcissist cannot. They lack internal tools to face genuine emotion. So instead, they look for an escape route. And the quickest escape is to pull you back in to resurrect the illusion of power. The apology here appears like a psychological fire extinguisher, an emergency move to put out the invisible fear spreading inside them. They are not apologizing for your pain. They are apologizing for their pain. The pain of realizing their power is slipping away, and they have nothing left to hold on to. The shadow in them cannot tolerate the void you create, so it pushes them to act softer, more accommodating, even repentant. But this is the repentance of a collapsing ego, not of a mature soul. Their apology is a sign that the shadow is overtaking them in ways they do not understand. They feel small, vulnerable, and more dependent than ever, and they don't know why. They only know one thing. They must do something to regain the stability they lost when you stopped being their mirror. And that leads them to the apology. Not because they have changed, but because the very darkness they buried has forced them to kneel in order to save a self that is sliding downhill. An apology, born of fear, not of the heart. When you understand this, you reclaim your power. You know their apology is not a sign of awakening, but a sign of panic. The most brutal truth for a narcissist is not that you leave, not that you block them, not even that you expose them. What hurts them most is the moment you no longer have feelings for them. Anger is still connection. Hurt is still connection. Arguing, explaining, crying, collapsing, all of these are invisible threads that keep them standing at the center of your world, but absolute calm, detachment, is what cuts every thread in silence. Calm detachment is not hostile coldness. It is a state in which you no longer pour emotional energy into them. You are no longer trying to fix, no longer trying to save, no longer trying to make them understand, no longer trying to prove anything. You simply stand there, steady and self-possessed, as if their existence no longer has the power to determine your state. And that is exactly what makes them crumble. In the narcissist's psychological model, they only feel valuable when your emotions are stirred by them. When you are angry, they feel strong. When you are hurt, they feel impactful. When you explain, they feel important. But when you stop reacting, you throw them into a void where they no longer know who they are in your story. Jung calls this the collapse of the personal. When the mask no longer works because the environment stops responding to it, calm detachment renders the persona useless. No one looks at it. No one feeds it. No one validates it. And when the mask loses its observer, it dissolves on its own. This is why calm detachment has more destructive power than any argument. And it not only strips them of power over you, it forces them to confront the truth that power never truly existed. When you are calm, you are no longer playing inside the emotional space they control. You are standing outside it, observing, not participating. This brings their power system down at the root, because they cannot manipulate someone who denies them access to their emotional world. Calm detachment also destroys the push-pull game they use to keep you in the cycle. When they attack, you don't respond. When they provoke, you don't shake. When they blame, you don't defend. When they try to seduce, for them this loss is greater than any physical distance. They lose the role of the one who has influence. And when that role disappears, their ego dissolves with it. Calm detachment doesn't give them what they need. It exposes what they fear most. The truth that they are not the center of the universe as they imagined. They no longer control you. They are no longer important. And they no longer live inside your inner world. Faced with that truth, they are forced to pivot to restore some sense of psychological safety. They may become gentle, sweet, even apologetic, just to re-establish the emotional connection that once fed them. But this apology is not born from the heart. It is born from the fear of losing you, as the anchor that kept them from falling into their own inner abyss. Calm detachment makes them realize they no longer have power. And to salvage whatever remains of that illusion, they are willing to do what they despise most: admit fault, even if only through a half-hearted apology. When you understand this, you are no longer shaken by those apologies. You see them only as the reflexes of an ego desperately clinging to the last scraps of control. The strangest thing about the moment a narcissist apologizes is not the words themselves, but their inner reaction. They apologize and even they don't know why. This is not sincerity, it is the uprising of the unconscious. A narcissist lives by the ego, the beautiful persona they built to escape the shadow. They rarely self-reflect, and even more rarely touch their real feelings. That's why so much of what they do is strategy, not truth. But when you calmly step out of their emotional orbit, when you are no longer the mirror through which they define themselves, their ego loses signal. And when the ego loses signal, the unconscious surfaces. Jung once said, when the conscious mind fails, the unconscious takes over. Their apology is the product of an unconscious trying to restore a psychological structure that has already cracked. They don't know why they are apologizing, because the behavior does not come from reason, it comes from their deepest fear. The fear of being left alone with the inner emptiness they've always run from. Their ego wants to maintain power, their unconscious wants to maintain supply. And when you are calm, these two forces collide in ways they cannot control. The apology comes out as a survival reflex, like the body gasping for air when held underwater, not to understand you, but to save themselves from the feeling of non-existence when you no longer react. In that moment, their mind operates according to a primitive template: secure the supply at any cost. And I'm sorry becomes the most efficient tool. But because it doesn't come from conscious awareness, they don't understand their real motive. They don't know why they want you to stay. They don't know why your silence causes panic. They only feel a hollow ache, a vague darkness. And they do the one thing that makes that sense of loss temporarily smaller: they apologize. So you will come back and reflect them again. That apology does not come from the heart. It comes from the fear of being erased from your mind. For the narcissist, the most terrifying thing is not losing you, but losing the right to exist inside your inner world. They cannot bear the idea that you might live your life without carrying them in your thoughts, your emotions, your heartbeat. That fear is so intense, it pushes them into behaviors they would normally see as weak or beneath them. They apologize to reclaim their position. Not their position in your life, but their position in their inflated sense of self. And because this fear lies so deep in the unconscious, they cannot put it into words. They don't understand why they're doing it. They only know they are losing power. And their psychological survival instinct forces them to do what they never wanted to do. This is why they apologize without knowing why. You don't need to believe the apology. You only need to understand it. It is evidence that they have lost the power they always thought they would have over you forever. When a narcissist apologizes, and even they don't know why, it does not open a new chapter of love. It marks the end of an energetic pattern you've been locked in for far too long. This ending is not loud, not dramatic, not explosive. It begins with calm inside you and ends with collapse inside them. Jung says that every action driven by the shadow carries with it a shadow consequence, a kind of psychological karma that the conscious mind cannot control. The narcissist's apology is one of those consequences. It is not remorse, it is an unconscious signal that the control model they built has broken. And once that model breaks, it cannot be repaired by a single, "I'm sorry." This apology is the final echo of a collapsing ego, the signal that the supply which once fed their inflation has left its orbit. When you reach a state of calm detachment, you have stepped out of the position they once put you in, the role of mirror, emotional container, and keeper of their illusion of power. Once you step out of that role, they may try to pull you back in, but the inner mechanism has flipped. You are no longer being drawn in. That's why the apology appears at the end of the journey, not at the beginning. It comes when they realize they've lost the secret war they themselves started, the battle to control your emotions. It is a sign you've broken the toxic energetic loop you were once trapped in. It's a sign that they've lost access to your unconscious, where they once ruled as a fabricated symbol. It's a sign that they no longer exist by feeding on your reactions. And most importantly, it's a sign that you are returning to yourself while they remain stuck inside the illusion they created. This apology cannot save anything because it does not arise from understanding. It carries no real change, no genuine awakening. It is nothing more than a defensive reflex of a self sliding off the edge. An apology without a heart is an apology without memory. They may say, "I'm sorry today," but tomorrow they will replay the same pattern because they do not understand your pain, they only understand their loss. That loss does not lead them into maturity, it only leads them into panic, and from that panic they reach out to cling to you. But when you are already calm and standing firm in your sovereignty, you see that apology as the final flicker of light before a shadow disappears from your life. It is not an invitation to return. It is a sign that you have stepped out of the loop and they can no longer follow. This is the shadow consequence. When you wake up, you step out of the unconscious role that once sustained their inflation. And nothing dies faster than a narcissist's power when the person they want to control stops reacting. The apology at this point is like the sound of a door closing on an energetic portal whose purpose has been fulfilled. And in that very moment, you step into the final stage of your journey. They lose you, but you take yourself back. There is something people who once loved a narcissist don't realize at first. You don't just lose them. You lose the version of yourself that existed inside that connection. That version was the one who gave too much, tried too hard, suffered to the point of exhaustion, yet still believed that if you loved enough, they would change. But when you enter the phase of calm, the calm detachment that everything before this has been leading toward, that old version of you falls away like a coat that no longer fits. This creates a profound shift not only in how you see them, but in how you see yourself. Jung once said, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And that is exactly what has happened. You have turned darkness into awareness. You see all the motives, patterns, and manipulations you once mistakenly called love. You see how exhausted you were trying to save someone who did not want to be saved. You see how lonely you were even while standing next to them. You see the injustice your heart had to carry. And in that moment of clear seeing, you don't just walk away from them, you walk away from the blind zone they planted inside you. The narcissist never truly understands that what they lose is not only control, but the old version of you, the version they could manipulate so easily. Once you change, they no longer stand in the same psychological universe they built. They are no longer the sun, they are just a small planet desperately trying to orbit a light they no longer own. And what drives them to despair the most is this: you no longer orbit around them, you no longer react, you no longer bleed from their little games, you are no longer triggered by their coldness or their rage. And from their perspective, this is not just your change, it is the collapse of an entire system they believed was indestructible. Because in narcissistic psychology, power is not in having you, it is in directing your emotions. When they can no longer touch your emotional world, they lose the entire reason their ego exists in their relationship. This is the apex of the shadow trigger. They are not apologizing because they understand you. They are apologizing because they cannot bear seeing that they no longer exist in your mind in the way they are used to. And the irony is, the more they apologize, the more they expose their loss of power. The more they don't understand why you are so calm. The more they fear why you are so strong. The more they worry why you no longer hurt because of them. But for you, this is no longer a victory in a battle between two people. It is personal liberation. It is the moment you realize that what you want is not for them to change, but for your life to change. The moment you understand that love is not about enduring, but about choosing yourself. The moment you look back and see that this story was never truly about how they loved you, it was about how you learned to love yourself in a place that once made you lose yourself. And when they apologize, you know this is not the beginning. It is the ringing of a bell announcing the end of a cycle, the end of an illusion, the end of an unconscious curse. And at the same time, it is the beginning of a journey you've never walked before, a journey where you are no longer governed by someone else's darkness, but guided by the light you have found within yourself. The narcissist apologizes because they have lost you, but you smile because you have finally found yourself. In the end, what you need to understand is not why they apologize, but why you no longer need that apology. At this stage, you have traveled far beyond your old versions. The one who trembled at their silence, who cried at their coldness, who broke down under the cycles of love, discard, pull, push. You no longer live in the layers of ego that made you cling to fragile scraps of "I'm sorry" in the hope of change. You stand in the light Jung calls reborn wholeness, where you no longer need anyone to validate your worth, no longer need anyone to reflect you back to yourself, no longer need anyone to illuminate the darkness you've had the courage to face. The narcissist will never understand that there comes a point in healing when you stop seeking answers from them. You seek answers from yourself. And when that happens, their apology loses all its power functions. It no longer pulls you back, no longer shakes you, no longer gets you to open the door, no longer serves as the reward they throw at you after emotional torture cycles. It becomes nothing more than a faint echo of a pattern you have outgrown, a final impulse of an ego desperately clinging to what once fed it. But the light of an awakened soul is not moved by echoes. That light does not need to prove anything. It only needs to exist. When you quietly become calm, you do not merely escape a person. You escape the entire narrative you were once imprisoned in. I'm not enough. I must try harder. I can change them. It's my fault. All those stories fall away from you like dead skin, revealing a version of you it took a very long time to find again. The free one. And this is the great paradox of the journey with a narcissist. They think you need their apology to heal, but in reality, the moment you no longer need it is the proof you have truly healed. Their apology does not save you, your awakening does. Your calm departure saves you, your recognition of your own worth saves you. Their shadow-born apology is only the final side effect of the shift you created when you stepped out of the role of victim and became the sovereign of your inner world. At the end of this journey, you do not defeat them. You defeat the part of yourself, the frightened shadow, that made you accept less than what you deserve. And that is what the narcissist will never understand. They believe they are the center of the story, but the story stopped being about them long ago. It is about you, about the resurrection of your soul, about the strength you found in your own silence. The narcissist will never understand why they apologized, but you understand why you no longer need it. And from the moment you understand that, the old chapter closes. Not with an explosion, not with tears, but with a deep peace their shadow will never be able to touch. You are free, and this time you are truly free.